Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California, just sitting in my chair, sweating as the heat wave descends upon Los Angeles. I have done very little, and yet I am covered in sweat today. I guess that is the next week and or rest of my life. But great episode today. Actually, I'm worried because, you can't have the air conditioner on really while you're recording a podcast. So I'm slightly worried about that stuff. And then, of course, worried for the globe and all human life. Well, I don't know. I was actually thinking about this the other day. All the evil humans have done, is it worth the good and the beauty we have brought into the world? I don't know. Anyway, we don't have to get into that here. That's not what this intro is for. This is not Marin. Today's guest is awesome. This is Lincoln Michel, and if you don't know who Lincoln is, I'm going to read you his bio right now. Originally from Virginia, author Lincoln Michel's fiction has appeared in the Paris Review, Pushcart Prize Anthology, and his essays and criticism have appeared in the New York Times, The Believer, The Guardian, and many other places. His debut story collection, Upright Beasts, was published by Coffee House Press in 2015, and his debut novel, The Body Scout, was published by Orbit just last year. It is great. I highly recommend it. I finished reading, and I immediately reached out to see if he would talk to me on the show. It reminded me a little bit of Jack Womack, if you know his fiction. Wonderful sci-fi writer, Jack Womack. And Lincoln's a dear, if I can be so bold to say that, or be so, for me, emotionally open to call someone else a dear. That's not my wife. But I really enjoy talking to him, and I like his writing a lot, so I hope you like this episode. And if you do, I have been doing this show for 12 years. What I like to do here in the beginning sometimes is a little recommended if you like. If you're a fan of Lincoln's work or you're a fan of writing in general, let's say, I have done a ton of interviews with authors. Not so many recently because since moving to Los Angeles, I don't have a subway to read on anymore, so it takes a little more self-motivation in order to read. I'm doing it though. I'm trying to get through my numerous bookshelves of books. But anyway, I have done tons of interviews with, like, say, the aforementioned Jack Womack, Martha Wells, Ben Marcus, Heidi Julavitz, Brian Evenson? Sorry, Brian. Chuck Klosterman, Helen DeWitt, Rick Moody, John Ronson, Harry Matthews, Sam Lipsyte, as well as writers from some of your favorite shows, including Game of Thrones, The Leftovers, and tons of others, Better Call Saul. So check out some old episodes. Subscribe if you like the show. Write a review. Actually, that really helps if you could write a review. I asked people like 12 years ago to write reviews, and then I stopped doing that. And I'm like, maybe I should ask people. If you're bored and at work, it takes like 30 seconds on Apple Podcasts. Also, I am on Twitter and Instagram at Andy Beckerman. Twitter for dumb jokes, Instagram for pictures of Naomi and the animals. And I got some great episodes coming up, including musicians like Laura Veers and Dear Nora, comics writers like Kieran Gillen. That was a very good one. I love Kieran's work, and especially his stuff that he's doing now on Eternals and X-Men is just brilliant. So stay tuned for those episodes. But for now, let's talk to Lincoln. What a momentous day it is. Today, Taika Waititi and Rita Ora got married, or the news hit. It got married. I'm just a buzz. I'm selling for them.
I had not seen that, actually.
That's not what I actually wanted to talk about. It's just the first thing that popped into my head. And so you moved to a new apartment. Is it near Columbia?
No, it's in Brooklyn, near the Botanic Gardens here.
Oh, nice. Is that a pain in the butt? How often are you teaching?
I teach at several different schools, all of which have very long commutes. So yeah, okay. It's quite a pain.
Okay. Wait, are you teaching? Sorry, I'm like now trying to hazily remember something I read online like a week ago or something. You do teach at Columbia, right?
I do, yeah. I teach there as an adjunct, so not every semester necessarily. So it's not, if it was my full-time job, maybe I would move up near there. But no, I taught there last semester. I'm teaching there in the fall. But yeah.
How is academia these days? I used to be a philosophy adjunct in Philadelphia at Temple and a bunch of other small. I wonder if it's the same thing as you, where I had to cobble together like 4 classes a semester. In Philly, I was barely scraping by, teaching like critical thinking at some small Catholic college, like on some train line outside of Philly.
Yeah, it is definitely the same for me. Although I'm lucky in that I've gotten into a few adjunct kind of recurring gigs in graduate school programs, which pay much better. It's still adjunct wages, but it's much better than the undergraduate, and yeah, it's sustainable, I guess.
Is it? I don't know what you can say for in the same way that like if you ask me like, so how corporate is entertainment, I might have to like watch what I say. So tell me if you can or cannot answer this. But when I was teaching, the mid-aughts. It started to get very corporate. And I remember the Temple philosophy department had to actually justify its existence to the administration, to the bureaucracy, by saying, "Oh, we're a pre-law program. Like, who gives a shit about Heidegger or whatever, right? But if you come to us, you can then go study the law and be a glorious lawyer or something." And that's how we somehow justified our economic worth to the college.
Well, I think it's certainly that way. I'm as an adjunct, I'm completely insulated from that. Like I don't have to deal with the department, and also teaching in graduate school. Those I think are maybe a little more self-sustained as programs. But yeah, you can go online and Google charts of the growth of the administrative state in academia, versus the number of teachers, and it's insane.
But does it impinge on the actual intellectual work that you want to do when you're teaching, or is it just kind of a side thing and you're like, yeah, it's annoying, but it's not, it hasn't actually affected the kind of work I want to do yet?
Well, it has no direct effect on me at all in that sense, but it's probably has an indirect effect in that there's, by cutting all the tenure track lines and hiring mostly adjuncts. I'm just speaking in general, not my universities per se. Yeah, there's less people who have the security to do. Yeah, my life would be a lot better if I had a tenure track secure job where I could, do whatever I wanted to do and had more time for quote unquote research, which is to say writing books and stuff.
Right.
But yeah, directly, no one's ever been like, oh, you cannot teach that short story or people are mad on Twitter about this author. You have to kick them off the syllabus or something. I haven't had any of that.
I'm just wondering that because I'm trying to think about like doing creative work in 2022, and as dystopia settles in, how does that change? How does because I know like a lot of musicians, like they can't rely on touring anymore. It used to, like, because of streaming, then it pushed everyone to do touring. And now because of COVID and monkeypox, Jesus, I was up at 2:30 in the morning looking up symptoms of monkeypox last night. Like, I think it broke me. I think this is the one that broke me. I was fine. I was okay, not fine, but I was learning to live with COVID. In a world of COVID, and then this happened, and I think it just kicked me into a well. But okay, so anyway, I'm just curious if you've kind of, as your own creative life has gone on, because you've been a writer for a long time, right? Have you noticed how this stuff is changing? It may not have for you. I'm just curious.
No, I think it's like a general phenomenon. What you're talking about, as far as I can understand it, is completely true, right? But I'm not going to say this is a good thing, but one of the things about being into writing weird fiction and literary fiction or bizarre science fiction or whatever is that you kind of never expected to make a lot of money. So there wasn't like a lot of routes to make money before for writers. you weren't going to be able to go on tour and have people pay a bunch of money to come see you.
Sure.
Right. They'll go for free, maybe. And then, you talk over the bar noise.
But yeah. Okay. Sorry, go on.
Oh, no, but my friends who are musicians or who are in other parts of the kind of artistic industry, I feel like it's hit them a lot harder.
Is there anything annoying about dystopia becoming real? As someone who writes comedy, there's something really annoying about reality lapping satire, where reality has become so crazy. I'm just like, okay, how am I supposed to heighten to like when I try to heighten something, it's now crazy instead of just like slightly like believable. Yeah, and that like it's very difficult. And I'm curious if you've been like, oh, how did this thing that I wrote about 5 years ago, now it's actually true?
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, a lot of what I write is pretty satirical, and it does feel like, I mean, everyone says this, but we live in an increasingly science fictional world anyway, even before all these dystopian elements are piled on top of it. So, yeah, I feel like sometimes I write something that feels like, to me, a bizarre, extreme joke, and then literally 6 months later, there's, an article about it.
Yeah. Yeah, go back to my Twitter 5 years ago, and it'll just read as if I'm just writing the news today, right? It's just like the jokes then are just reality now.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I'm sure that this topic has been done to death, so we don't really have to talk about it. But, Donald Trump alone is just the way he speaks is so ridiculous and so over the top, and it's like, how do you parody that? Like, you can't write a character, whether it's in a science fiction novel or a sketch comedy bit, who is much more extreme than that. He's kind of at the limit.
You have to lean into the darkness. Anthony Atamanuik, I don't know if you ever saw The President Show, but Anthony Atamanuik nailed it, in which he just leaned into the darkness of the character, and he played Trump on a fictional talk show called The President Show, and leaning into the libidinal impulses, the like death drive that like underlies that person, the actual human being, I think was the only comedic take that worked or has worked at all. I guess maybe the guy who's on SNL now kind of does it well, where he does the chatterbox version, which is just like letting the id just keep talking. Mm-hmm. So those are the two, I think those are maybe the two only ways you can do it. One is the kind of like non-political, just let the id go. And the other is lean into the death drive and just follow that out to its end result.
Yeah, I guess that's one way to do it, is you just take like a kind of right turn with it, right? Like you bring the language into a different level of some sort. Yeah, that makes sense.
So were you attuned to this kind of stuff when you were younger? Like when you write, when you write like anything that is fantastical at all, right? Were you in some way, I think, to write it well, and maybe, I mean, tell me if this is not the way you do it, but like in some way to write it well, you have to be kind of attuned to like what's going on and be able to kind of just be like, all right, what's the next step of this? And I'm going to try to write a world into that next step. And so you have to be, I think, both self-aware and aware of the world in some way. Maybe not like actually aware, but like attuned, I guess, is probably the better word I'm looking for. And I'm kind of curious if you were like that as a child, or if that's just something that developed as you got older.
Well, I think when I was a child, I don't know if I was or not. I would think not exactly. I grew up in kind of rural Virginia, and when I was a young child, my family lived on a property that was like really in the woods, and we had no neighbors, and we had friends and stuff, but I felt very isolated, and definitely spent my time, I don't know, this sounds corny or something, but in the worlds of other media, right, and art, right? So I read a lot of books, and I watched TV shows, and like to paint Warhammer action figures and stuff like that. But by the time I was a teenager, I got very into the punk scene, and was very into a lot of very political bands who were certainly talking about the larger world, and often in a very satirical, grotesque, hyperbolized way. So probably a lot of that sunk into me by the time I started writing fiction.
What are we talking about? So we're about the same age. So it could be Fugazi. It could be I don't know. Which bands are we? Are they local bands?
Well, initially, I definitely got into the Dead Kennedys were my biggest band when I was young, a very political band. And so a lot of those kind of older bands, The Clash, Black Flag, kind of the usual suspects, so to speak. But when I was older, there was a lot of good DC area bands, the kind of DC, Virginia bands that I really loved. Page 99, City of Caterpillar, Fugazi, certainly. A lot of those kind of bands.
Yeah, it's interesting that, so for us, we were either non-existent or babies when, hardcore was really hitting. And so I only got into it in the 90s. I guess Rollins Band. Then drew me backwards to Black Flag and then all the stuff, and it introduced me to this whole world. It's funny about Dead Kennedys because there are so many politicians he names in those things that I had no idea who. Outside of watching old Saturday Night Live episodes, I had no idea what's going on. I think it's that there's something about Dead Kennedys that's particularly interesting in that it is like old SNL. In that there's a lot of references to 70s politicians who you're just like, what? And you have to go actually do research. It's one of those bands that makes you kind of curious about this decade that happened before you were anything.
Oh, definitely. One of their most famous songs is all about how horrible Jerry Brown is. and it's all stuff that makes no sense unless you go research it, or makes no sense to a kid growing up in the 90s in rural Virginia. I don't know about what the hippies are doing coming to claim your uncool niece.
That's exactly what I was thinking about. Yes, it's Jerry Brown. And I'm the only time I've ever heard about Jerry Brown is in a Dennis Miller joke or something like that. But I'm curious. Okay. You said rural area. I read that it was 20 minutes outside of anything. Is that true?
Oh, so I grew up, maybe a 20-minute drive from Charlottesville, Virginia. So not middle of nowhere. I just mean that I grew up really in the woods. I didn't really have neighbors when I was a young child. But I grew up in Charlottesville, or outside of Charlottesville, and so we would go into town, and there was, Charlottesville's kind of a nice... Well, nowadays, people know what Charlottesville is because, Nazis marched there. Sure. Before that, no one ever knew Charlottesville. When I went to school in D.C. and then moved to New York, and everyone always thought I was talking about Charlotte, North Carolina, and just adding a ville on or something. But Charlottesville is kind of a nice town. It has plenty of problems too, obviously, but it was a kind of artsy, liberal oasis in Virginia. Kind of like a mini version of Austin, Texas or something. Just in the sense that there's book festivals and film festivals and, it's a college town and such.
So wait, how did the Nazis end up marching there?
Well, there was someone who went to UVA for school who picked that area. But what happened was there was a statue of Robert E. Lee that it's just in this park, and the people there had wanted to remove it for a while, and they were about to remove it, and so then the Nazis were like, "We're going to protest the removal of this Confederate statue." But most of the people who came there were certainly not from Charlottesville. Most weren't even from Virginia. It was a lot of militias from Ohio and stuff coming down, which is also very bizarre and dystopian about our present moment, right? That I grew up where there were people wearing Confederate flags and stuff, which was always not something I liked, but you could almost understand it in the South. And now people are up in rural Oregon decked out in Confederate flags. What is your relation to this?
Yeah. Okay. So
racist.
Yeah. So it'd be if a bunch of 3%ers marched in Ann Arbor or something like that. That's kind of the vibe that I'm getting.
Yeah, it was basically a somewhat liberal. I'm not painting Charlottesville as any kind of leftist utopia, but it's a liberal area, votes very blue, and the people there wanted to remove a statue, so that a bunch of other people were we're going to come march.
Okay, but growing up there, was it you said that people wore Confederate flags, or there were Confederate flags around? Was there anything overt about that, or was it just this kind of ambient racism that was in the air?
From my perspective, it was pretty ambient, and I'm sure if I was not white, it would not feel that way.
Sure.
But So just to clarify, I'm thinking of the Confederate flags more in my high school in the rural area. So I went to high school and middle school and elementary school in the county, not in Charlottesville proper. But there was definitely a kind of culture of, kids who would dress in camo and have all their hunting gear ready and wear Confederate flags and such. They weren't my friends, but there was that too. That was pretty kind of ambient in the air. But when I do remember when I was in high school, I kind of joined up with some local punk kids to form an anti-racist action group. And we kind of had a hard time figuring out what to do in terms of what to protest, because there weren't a lot of
right
like KKK rallies and such happening back then, and now they are happening. So that feels like a sign of the shift in, the dystopia that you're talking about.
How did you fit in? Okay, so like you're into the punk scene, you're into RPGs, things like that, right? How do you fit into a kind of like, in my mind, and tell me how inaccurate this is, it's a bunch of like, I'm guessing like sports loving and like people who like guns. If there is this kind of contingent of like kind of like racist, I'll say hicks around, like how do you fit in at all, or if maybe you don't?
Well, I always felt like an outsider, which is probably true of most people who grow on to be writers or something, and mostly an outsider for my interests or something. Some of that was like music and politics that I got into when I was young, like via music. Some of it was just a kind of love of weird, grotesque, bizarre stuff. The stuff that that captivated me the most when I was young was earliest were things like surrealist art, David Lynch movies. Probably a lot of stuff that's not uncommon for a lot of the guests you have on this show. But I wasn't like it wasn't so oppressive either, in the sense that, I don't know, there was a mix. I had friends I had plenty of friends, and some of them were into similar music, and there was like a contingent of goth kids at the school, and a contingent of punk kids, and a contingent of band geeks and whatnot. It was kind of a mix. It wasn't like the gun-toting rednecky types ran the school by any means, or at least that was not an issue. Okay.
So it wasn't oppressive to go to school in this area?
Yeah, I didn't feel so. I mean, it was still like a somewhat kind of liberal area and all of that. But I did feel like an outsider, certainly. I, was very anti-religious and very kind of left-wing in my politics from a young age, which wasn't the norm. But it was kind of more an ambient oppressiveness to the whole, growing up in the South in general. I mean, I do have memories of things like, someone telling me I was going to burn in hell because I didn't believe in God on the bus to school and stuff. But I just kind of thought those people were ridiculous, so I didn't feel too offended by it.
Sure. So what's your gateway into surrealist art and David Lynch and stuff? I mean, we're both growing up before the internet, so it's by happenstance that anyone gets into anything in this age. I mean, Twin Peaks maybe is the thing, but what was it for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really remember. I think I just kind of stumbled on something and stumbled on other things. One thing I do remember is that I grew up, and me and my friends went to this weird pool that was in the middle of the woods, and it was filled with like river water, and it was a very strange kind of magical place, and now it's been sold to some day camp or something. But anyway, the lifeguards there were older than us, and they were punk kids, and they gave us some of our first like punk CDs. They were like, check out Gorilla Biscuits, check out Minor Threat, and from there, musically, that's how I found stuff. I don't really remember how I first got into weirder movies and books and stuff, except that at some point we used to record movies from TV. And for some reason, David Lynch's Dune was like one of the VHS tapes that me and my brother had recorded from TV, and I watched that like over and over. I know it's like his like least acclaimed movie at this point, but I still think some of it is pretty amazingly bizarre.
I've never gotten through it. I've tried watching it 3 to 4 times maybe, and I just fall asleep. And that's if I fall asleep 20 minutes into something and I and that happens over and over again, I've learned maybe that's not for me.
Well, that's very fair. I mean, the critiques of it are certainly correct. Like, it's totally a mess. I think Lynch himself says it's a mess. Structurally, it doesn't make sense. But there are moments of kind of really beautiful costumes and set designs and certain moments that are great.
I'm sure. I'm not knocking it or knocking you for loving it. When I was younger, I would have been arrogant and I would have said something like, "It's crap." As an adult, I'm like, it's not for me. And you know what? I think therapy has done its job. If I'm at this place, therapy has done its job. So, okay. So you somehow get into this stuff. Did your parents like weird things at all?
Not really. I mean, I do. My father was into some science fiction novels and comic books. I remember he learned to read via comic books. I remember he used to buy me comic books, and me and my brother comic books. And he did give me some early science fiction novels that I quite liked. I remember he gave me Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, which is, of course, genius, and Frank Herbert's Dune, and Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. I liked all of those. But I really got into high school. Somehow I got into like Italo Calvino and Franz Kafka. And I really don't remember how. It was kind of the early days of the internet. So some of it, I was kind of an early internet message board user. Mm-hmm. You know, it was before the days that you could just go online and Google like 20 best, weird fantasy novels or something. Right. But you couldn't go to Goodreads and see what people were reading. But you could kind of find some stuff if you dug around or got recommendations online. So it might have been that way.
Were you on bulletin board systems at all?
I don't remember like the exact systems that they were used, but I was on a bunch of like punk message boards, and like there was one that I used to be on called Internet Infidels that was like an agnostic atheist board, but they would have like a music channel and all of that.
I would call up, so you would get a phone number of a BBS, a bulletin board system, and then there you could get like it was basically like a message board you had to call into. But what I didn't understand was that even if you used a modem, long distance tolls applied. And so my dad comes in one day with a very long phone bill and is like, "Why are you calling Allentown all the time?" And it was because it was for this thing. But that's how. I think I'm a little older than you. But like I think that was like the early '90s was the days of modems and bulletin board systems, and then AOL, and then the early internet kicks in, and that there's message boards there. If my timeline is correct at all, if my own personal timeline is actually accurate for culture's timeline.
Yeah, I'm 39, so for me it was more like the mid late 90s when I was in high school.
Yeah, that's I remember I could dial up in my physics class because my physics teacher sucked and wasn't really paying attention to what I was doing. And I could dial up to the pavement message board and download giant waves of pavement B-sides that I would put on a 3.5. I could fit one on a 3.5 inch disc and then go home and listen to this pavement B-side that now I can just go download anywhere.
Oh, yeah. I definitely remember the days of Napster and SoulSeek and all of those programs.
So, okay. So what were your parents like when you were growing up?
My parents were very nice. I like my parents. I kind of, I was listening to some episodes of the show, so I know this is something that you talk about a lot, and I find it interesting. But I always kind of felt like my parents were not such a factor in my artistic and intellectual development, except in the ways that they did not hinder it, if that makes sense. Like they were the kind of very good parents who would let me do stuff, but maybe not let me go too far. We're not like, I don't know. I never felt like I was rebelling against them, nor was I like following in their footsteps, but they were kind of always encouraging of whatever I was interested in, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. I think my parents were relatively the same way, but I'm more curious than like, what about your emotional development? Like, I do think that there is some for most people, maybe not all, but I'll hedge it by saying most people, you do push against them in some ways. And I'm wondering, what were those ways where you kind of tried to differentiate yourself from them in this parental dialectic we call parenthood?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that that's true. I feel like I remember it a lot more strongly with like my peer group and my classmates. Like, you know, I remember liking to I like discovering art and music and books and stuff that no one else was reading. And not, you know, I know that can sound very pretentious. I mean, for me, I was always kind of like, look, I found this. You all should read it too. It's great. Not like, oh, right. I don't want anyone else to read it. But I think there was definitely a drive to carve out my own identity in that way in school, even if it was just for me, you know, just that I could think that I was doing stuff different from everyone else.
What was pushing that? Because for me, there was a kernel of that where, and I actually had to, as a writer, I had to get out from under that eventually, but this kind of drive to be iconoclastic to the point where like it drove me into writing like nonsense sketches that no one at UCB could understand because I was constantly pulling the rug out from everyone every 3 lines or something like that. But I'm like, but it's unique. No one's ever done this. And then it's kind of like, yeah, there's a reason no one's ever done this. It's because an audience can't follow what you're doing. But like, but that goes back to this kind of like ancient childhood thing where I was like desperate to be a unique person. And I'm kind of curious for you, like what was driving you, or what was driving this kind of like enjoyment of this media, even if you weren't like, even if you weren't hoarding it, you were like, everyone should do this.
Yeah. I mean, I probably should like go into psychoanalysis for this question. I do think that I felt an oppressiveness to the culture I was in general, right? Which is probably why I identified with bands like the Dead Kennedys, who are like singing about how the moral majority sucks and, you know, right. the Republicans suck and everything. And even though Charlottesville itself was a kind of relatively liberal town, Virginia was still back then a very red state. And I was certainly, you know, almost everyone was religious, and it was the kind of thing you go into the mall or something and people are trying to hand you flyers about Jesus. And, you know, so I found all of that very oppressive. It just like not something I was not interested in. And part of that was like a political and ideological reaction against it. And I certainly grew up reading, you know, probably a lot of the same books that you did too. Lots of Chomsky and stuff like that. But I also feel like I kind of wanted to retreat into maybe some other realities. And that's why I was reading authors like Murakami and Italo Calvino and people who weren't American and maybe not even contemporary, and just getting into their visions of a different kind of world.
Did you have that self-awareness though before you started reading these works or these people, or was it through reading that stuff that it allowed you to peel off? Like if you hadn't, like, this is a counterfactual, but if you hadn't read these people or you hadn't discovered Dead Kennedys or something like that, would you have ended up being the same as everyone else? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It's a great question, and I don't know the answer, but I do feel like from a very young age, I always wanted to be different, and I don't know if that's a good instinct or not. And part of that is, you know, I know that there's a certain privilege in that, right? Being like a white dude, being like, oh, I wanted to be different. You know, I didn't grow up where I was picked on for being different, other than those religious nutjob types. And so, yeah, I don't know. I can acknowledge that, but I never understood that drive of like characters in movies and books that are like, all I want is to be normal. I never got that. I never wanted to be normal. I always wanted to be different. I always wanted to be like an artist from as long as I could remember.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I was about to say blame capitalism in a very loose way, which doesn't really make sense. But in some way, like, there's this kind of maybe it's just the American spirit of individualism. I'm being slightly ironic, but like there is something where like you're in America. I'm putting this together as I'm asking you this question, or as I'm like saying this, but I'm like, it's weird how in America there's this drive, like this guy kind of like Ayn Randy, and everyone's their own person, everyone's unique, but also there's this counter drive that's like you have to be part of the masses and you have to like fit in with everyone and watch Young Sheldon or whatever the fuck everyone's watching, right? Like, and if you don't do that, then you don't understand culture or something like that. And it is interesting to me, and I don't have anything interesting to say at the moment, but like I just putting it together, I'm like, oh, it's weird how those two strains kind of wind through all of our lives in some way.
Yeah, I think that's very true. But yeah, I don't know how I really got onto the kick of thinking that the standard way of living was so boring or something. And it might have been from listening to all those punk bands that like the worst thing that some old punk singer can say is like, oh, you're going to have a white picket fence and 2.5 children or something. And now we're like, oh, that sounds kind of nice to have a house. But
yeah. Oh yeah. It would be, if we could afford real estate. Oh my God. Did you see something in your parents? Like as much as I love my parents and they were, anything that they did was just like a small T trauma, not like anything real, right? But there was something in them that at my core, I just did not. I'm like, oh, I just don't want this. And I don't know if it was just like them like not liking their jobs, and I kind of like naturally saw like just like picked that up and couldn't articulate it, but just had this feeling. I'm like, oh, if they don't like their jobs and they're not like. And like they have all these problems, like the contractor didn't build the basement right, and there's no sump pump, and now we have a flood or whatever, right? And I'm just getting these signals, and I'm like, maybe this isn't the right way to live. And I'm wondering if you picked up certain things. Again, I'm not saying that like your parents did anything bad, but I'm just saying that just like you picked up some like little things that like you ended up internalizing and being like, oh, maybe I don't want to do what they're doing.
Yeah, well, on the other hand, my father I think he was really interested in art and stuff when he was younger, and he had kind of stopped and had a kind of more traditional career when I was, growing up, when I was a kid. But then when I got older, he kind of got back into art again once me and my brother were older, and now he like does a lot of art. He's kind of does etchings and a lot of wood prints and stuff that are quite lovely. So I kind of wonder if I picked up on that on some level, like an artistic yearning that he had that maybe got transferred to me, even though I was never very good at visual art. But
it's all the same, right? It's all this, like it's all connected. I'm terrible at visual art, but like it's that same kind of spirit then gets in you, and you figure out the thing that you are good at, which for you is writing.
Yeah, and for me, I very much, like, I knew I always wanted to be an artist from, I don't know, as young as I can remember. And then I was just very bad at every art form I tried until I got to, like, writing. Like, I was kind of tone deaf, never really got music. I'm a horrible handwriting, which translates to very, very bad... very bad illustration skills,
Yeah, no, I'm with you. My wife and I, we do a podcast together and some other stuff. And I forget. Oh, we were getting a notes call for something, and I was about to take the notes, and she took the pen out of my hand. She's like, "I want to be able to read these notes, so I'm gonna take them."
Oh, I honestly can barely read my own handwriting when I write in the margins of a manuscript and go back to read it. It's quite bad.
Yeah. So maybe that you saw this thing from your dad, and it kind of like, oh, he kind of wanted to do this too, because I think we pick up on regret from our parents in a way. Maybe that's unarticulated again. I think a lot of the stuff, I mean, I don't know about your own emotional development, but like, it took me until going to therapy to really kind of like figure this stuff out, have the language to figure this stuff out that before just kind of like sat dormant in my body. But like, I do think we pick up on little clues, little emotional clues from our parents.
Yeah, I do remember my parents being very encouraging of whatever I tried to do artistically, including quitting trying things. I took like bass lessons for a couple of years and did drum one semester and all that kind of stuff. But I do remember my parents kind of doing a lot of projects of different sorts, whether it was like gardening or, doing this or that. And so there was kind of, maybe that was built up into me too, like the idea of just like making things and doing things as something.
I mean, was it an emotionally open household, or was it one where Well, I mean, you describe it.
I don't know. I wouldn't call it super openly emotional. Although I think people probably wouldn't call me very openly emotional now either. So,
is that something that has been a problem, or are you just like, it's fine?
No, I feel like it's okay. I feel like it takes all kinds. I can be like a little robot over here, and other people can be doing their thing.
Is it? Well, I'm curious because I do think it takes empathy and emotional awareness to be a good writer or good anything in the arts. And I'm curious do you just like not let it out? Because you obviously have empathy and have an emotional awareness. So like, how does it actually function for you?
I don't really talk about this much, and it probably is going to sound very weird, but I've always kind of felt like I view everything from a bit of a remove in my own life, in that I'm kind of like watching what is happening in a certain way. And that it's actually been somewhat useful to me as from a writer, because an artistic point of view, because I feel like I can kind of see the humor in the bizarreness of daily interactions without letting them affect me so much emotionally. This is kind of inarticulate, but I don't know. I used to work in restaurants, and I would be treated like the way everyone works in a restaurant is like just lots of shitty customers, lots of ridiculous stuff. But I never got mad because I always just kind of like, this is a bizarre interaction that can be like material later. So I've had that kind of remove in my life, I feel like.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I think I was like that for most of my life, where it was just like I was alienated. And I wonder if this is the difference in that when I moved to New York to do comedy and was performing, I'm holding my hands up as like a mime, like I'm at a window. I had to like push through the window eventually because I could do that as a writer, but as a performer, I needed to be more present. But most of my life has been at that kind of like alienated remove. My therapist now has been talking about how like when I was younger, it's not that I was repressing emotions. It's that I was just kind of like watching them happen. Like I was just sitting there like, oh, this is interesting that this is happening to me. And like, I'm feeling this. Huh.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question in terms of, what kind of emotional situation or mindset or something works best for different art forms. Because, yeah, I can imagine I would probably be not a very good actor. But maybe like a kind of remove helps if you're for imagining different characters and getting into the heads of lots of different people or something. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, I think for sure, because it's become, I've had like, if I want to write in a script a different character now, I have to like change the way my body is in a certain way to actually, otherwise I'll just write the same kind of like way that I'll just write me into that character. But then if I like change the way my body is as I'm typing or something, or like think of the person the way their body is in the scene that I'm writing, I have to do that to get into their, otherwise before I was just writing, well, it was just nonsense. So I guess it doesn't, there is just me writing nonsense and then me being able to actually write well. So maybe that's more of the dividing line.
Well, this is funny for me to hear you talk about this, because there was definitely like an alternative timeline in which I went into comedy, and the kind of stuff I was interested in writing and trying to write sounds like what you were saying. Very bizarre stuff that didn't really work structurally, but was just like, I'm going to push it as far as I can. But then I realized, yeah, that probably wouldn't work. Yeah,
well, yes. If we had gotten to New York 5 years earlier, it would have worked. I got there. My timing was always so bad. And so I ended up like all the stuff that I wanted to do in comedy, instead of going to New York to do that, I went to grad school and then became a philosophy professor and then went to New York. And so I was 8 years out of sync with whatever everyone else was doing. And it didn't work out right.
Do you feel like your philosophy degree influences your comedy?
Yeah, in a bad way. In a way where I'm just like, I have to like suppress. I have to translate stuff now. Like I can't just like launch into talking about like Heidegger and Dasein, because how many people have read that or understand it, right? And it has to be like, oh, if I want to even talk about this, which I shouldn't, but my brain goes there. Do you know? I don't know if you know that if that happens to you, where it's just like the stuff you've read like warps your brain in a certain way, and that like instead of like making a joke about Bob Loves Abishola or whatever, I don't know, whatever some people are watching or something like that, my brain goes to like, you know, a joke about Hegel or something like that. And I'm just gotta like, I have to suppress that and be like, that's not fun. Like, it's funny to you and no one else.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm one of those very online people who waste most of my day on Twitter, and it totally warps your brain, right? Like there's like a format of joke and a kind of reference that you learn on in any social media platform or something like that. I was asking too because I remember thinking that would be my fallback career as being a philosopher, which I'm sure I would have been horrible at, but I like almost studied it and had my minored in philosophy.
Wait, why do you think you would be bad at it?
Oh, I don't know. That just sounds very like arrogant to say my fallback career was being a philosopher. But I remember thinking that if I couldn't succeed as an artist, I would be in academia in some way. I mean, I guess I'm in academia now.
Like you said, look, listen to this. When I was in grad school, I was doing comedy on the side, but I was saying, hey, I'm getting my PhD just in case the comedy thing doesn't work out. So I am I'm resonating with you. I'm feeling the same feeling. You're on the same wavelength. I understand that on a deep level.
Well, I don't think I was ever very good at philosophy. Like, you know, there's philosophers I love and still love and should really reread again. But it was one of those fields where I like really was getting, 25% of it, and the other 75% I was like, I don't know what's happening.
The other 75% was probably bullshit. Honestly, it's like you got to find like, there's a handful of philosophers that are actually good writers, and there's no pressures on them to be good writers. There's just pressures to just like churn out bullshit, honestly. And so that's what they do. And so it's just like, okay, you got this printed in a journal and now you can get tenure. It's all like, it's all very, and this is cynical, I'll say this. So it's not, so take it with a grain of salt. But a lot of it was just like the same. That's why I kind of started out talking about like the corporatization of academia, because it's just like churn out stuff so you can get tenure, so you can pay your mortgage, so you can have a nice vacation in Tuscany, so you can have, so you can come back with a new perspective and write a new paper and then present it at a conference, and then you get some more clout and you get a little prestige and that gives you an award and blah, 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 right? And that's it. And it's just this eternal hamster wheel of bullshit. A lot of it, not all of it. There's a lot of great philosophy, but I think a lion's share of it is that kind of process.
Yeah, Yes, that sounds quite accurate to what I understand of academia. I think, one thing that is kind of nice about being in the creative writing field is it's like a little removed from that, just because you are expected to write stuff that like will sell to a publisher, and like having a story in the Paris Review or wherever is like considered a good thing. Whereas like in academia, It's often like, no, we want it to be in some very obscure journal that no one can read and cost you got to pay $50 to even get a subscription to that one article or something.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that eventually turned me off of philosophy, was that it was so cloistered, that there was no attempt for anyone to want to be a public intellectual or to engage with anything outside of those four walls, outside of the ivory tower.
Yeah, I never understood that as someone who, like, even though I always wanted to be an artist and always wanted to be like a weird artist and was into all those people we've talked about, I always wanted to like connect with some people, to like have my vision be shared with, even if it was a small audience, like an audience, not just like the 10 other professors I know or something.
Yeah, exactly. What were your parents doing for work when you were growing up?
So my father was a real estate agent, and my mother worked from home like a stay-at-home mom, not work from home, for a while, and then went back to work as a nurse practitioner at a gastroenterology firm.
Did they like their jobs?
I think so. My father is very much a people person, and I think he really liked, connecting with people, and like finds a lot of like joy and interest in helping them, which I think, he felt like he was doing. It's wild being in New York, where like being a real estate agent or a broker is just like totally different from anywhere else. Like, my father shows people different properties, helps them get a good deal. When I go like rent an apartment in New York, just someone like shows up, unlocks the door, and is like, "Do you want it or not? Give me $5,000." But so I think he was pretty happy with that. He definitely worked a lot and drove around a lot and wasn't. I don't know. He works a lot, and my mother definitely loved being a nurse. I should say she retired a couple of years ago, but for maybe similar reasons, like likes the idea of helping people.
You said your dad was a people person. Do you think that took up a lot of room? Does that make sense as a question?
Took up a lot of room?
Yeah. Do you think him being a people? I'm wondering if so again, I'm stuck on this like dialectic idea. So you can be like, Andy, you're barking up the wrong tree if I am. But like, I'm wondering if like him being a people person, you kind of like naturally fall back because he's taking up the space, and not in a negative way, but just like, I wonder if there's that kind of movement there.
I wouldn't say that it was like that within our family unit. My father's like the kind of people person in that, and I'm not like this as much, but he's the kind of person who, if we like take a cab somewhere, wants to sit in the front and talk to the cab driver and learn their life story. He enjoys learning about other people's lives and has that kind of interest. But I wouldn't say that he took up an inordinate amount of the space in like a family situation.
Right. But he did that role. He had that role. Because I remember my friend Steve was a writer, and he would talk to strangers to kind of just like try to understand their lives for his writing. And I'm just like, ooh, why are you talking to a stranger? I just go retreat into my brain and then figure out what's going on in there, and then I'll spill that onto the page. And if it feels wrong or inaccurate, I can always look up facts or something like that. But like, it starts here. And I think I developed like that. Like, my dad is kind of gregarious and can talk to people. He doesn't talk to strangers, I don't think, but like he does. When I say take up space, I don't mean like in a malignant way, but I just mean that like he takes that role on and then I don't have to.
Well, that might be true. I definitely have always felt more of a observer type, right? Like, I'm going to sit back, and if I don't, if I know people, I'll be very gregarious and extroverted. But if I don't, I'm kind of sit on the back of the edge of the party and observe what's going on and maybe make mental notes about bizarre details or funny happenings or something.
Yeah. It's also, for me at least, an entropy thing. Like, the energy that it takes to be gregarious, I don't always have the reserves for that. And I'm wondering if it's similar for you, if you just have like I do think that there, for a lot of people, it's just like I think about someone like Kevin Hart or Kanye, who seems to have an inordinate, they have lots of energy for whatever reason. I think it's just a biological thing, right? There's just some extra bit of like energy in their cells, whatever. Maybe they have like a couple extra mitochondria. I don't know what the like deal is, but like there are some people who are biologically happen to have tons of energy, and they're like they can do 1,000 things, and they're able to keep that up till like 3 a.m, whereas like I'm not. And I wonder if it's the same for you.
I kind of feel like I'm a bit more go with the flow in general, and that like I can be very extroverted for really long periods of time. And obviously, I live in New York, and there's lots of stuff here, but then I also really enjoy doing something like a writing residency where I'm basically alone in a cabin for a month. I can kind of go like either way. I never really identified so much with the introvert extrovert binary and the idea that like you get energy from one way or the other. I feel like either can work for me.
Yeah. It changes depending on the context. I think. And I do, as most things we're learning in the 21st century, it is a spectrum. And it changes based on that context. It is not a fixed, it's not a fixed dice roll. It's not, didn't roll a 20-sider 6 times when you first started life and then apportion those things out. And now that's your strength and your charisma. I don't know why I kept going on with that metaphor.
I would say most people would say that I'm an extrovert. Most of my friends would, if they were going to decide.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, growing up in a rural area, at least for the first part of your life, right? I'm wondering if how that felt. If there was any, if you felt resonance with the woods at all, or if it was just like it could just also be just a fun place to explore, or it could be just like, that's where I was. I don't know. I'm curious.
Well, I definitely feel like now it holds a lot of power for me, like the memory of just being in the woods and being in nature in that way. When I was the first place I grew up on, we really were surrounded by woods, except for there was like one farm that one of the cow pastures abutted our backyard. So like my only neighbors were some cows. And I have a lot of fond memories of going through the woods and playing in creeks and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm really glad that I had that now, like as an adult. But I definitely 100% felt a strong urge to be where people were, where art was happening, where things were happening, where there was a music scene. I always wanted to be in New York or some other large city, since I was young. So on one hand, I'm very glad I grew up with that kind of nature around me, but yeah, it definitely drove me to want to move to a city. So
was it that pastoral kind of nothingness that pushed you, or do you think you had that drive in you from something else? Well,
yeah, I mean, I think it was also just the town too. It was like a small town that we were near. Charlottesville is like a pretty small place, especially outside of UVA campus. And, I was always trying to do things. I always wanted to do projects and all this kind of stuff. And I had good friends and we did some stuff, but, I would always like try to start a band, but we could never find enough members who were interested in the same music, could never find a drummer who liked the same kind of music or whatnot. And I just like wanted to be somewhere where things could happen, but also, yeah, maybe that is it, like where things could happen, right? Because like few people, I mean, this is maybe not true, especially now in the internet era, but it felt like if you weren't in one of these major cultural centers, no one was going to pay attention to what you were doing.
Yeah.
So I definitely had that feeling. Again, it may be quite false, and I think it's probably is kind of false now in the internet, social media era, where you can really get your work out there in lots of different ways. But yeah, when we were growing up, it wasn't like that, right? Like,
yeah,
you could go play at a club in DC or LA or New York or that was it. No one was coming out to your cow pasture in Virginia.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, and we're right at the end of the show, and I think there are just all these little pieces for all of us, and including you, as we've talked for this last hour, that give me a constellation that kind of makes me understand like what made you go do this, as opposed to, you could have done real estate like your father, right? You could have just followed the path, and it's not bad. I'm not saying that's a bad thing to have done that, but I'm curious, like, what was the thing in you that eventually made you want to like, well, I do. Okay. I mean, part of it's like, I want to connect, right? I think I got that from you, where you're like, I want to connect to other people. And maybe that comes from like this like alienation in some way. Maybe it comes from this starting off in this kind of pastoral nothingness or whatever. Right. But like, what was it that like, okay, I do want to write, and I want people to read the things I've written. I want to make art, and you figure out all these different ways that you're like, well, it's not going to be music. It's not going to be this, that you could have just like not done that. And you could have just been like, and again, I'm not knocking this, but I'm saying like, you could have followed in the path of like everyone else in your town.
Yeah. I mean, I think I always had this feeling that I wanted to, make some impact on the world, right? Like, have one's existence have some kind of, it is very kind of existential or something, but have some kind of, leave some kind of impression, right, in the sands of existence or something, like stir the grains a little bit. And I guess, for some people, they find that through, I don't know, career or family or something. But for me, I always knew that like, that wasn't, I don't know why I'm laughing at that. That's probably, the better way to do it. But for me, I just wanted to have some more of an impact, like impose my own vision or ideas on the world in some way, I think.
Yeah. This is a crazy Hail Mary throw. But like, did you have an understanding of mortality from a young age?
Yeah, probably. I think I thought about death a lot.
I wonder if because that was it for me. Again, I'm just like projecting my own personality onto you and see if it works or not. But like, I had an understanding of mortality from a young age, and I wonder if that pushed me to be like, you got maybe 80 years or so. You better like do something meaningful. Or again, this is not articulate. Like, I'm a child. This is not articulated, but like, it's like, oh, okay, this ends. Uh-oh.
Oh yeah, I definitely felt that way. I think that's quite true. I still feel that way when I slack off, which I do most days, right? My brain is like, you do not have that much time on this planet. Like, is this really, you want to be playing a video game for 2 hours? Like, you need do something that matters, you know?
Yeah. Is Mario Rabbids really worth the when you're on your deathbed, are you going to be like, I should not have played that extra level of Mario Rabbids. I should have got back to my computer.
But, you know, there's also like this, I wish I could remember the exact quote, but there's a good quote by Werner Herzog where he says something like, happiness is, someone asks him like if he wants to be happy. And he's like, no, I don't think about being happy. Like, that's not how I'm measuring my existence. And then I forget the rest of the quote, but I'm going to pretend what he says is something about how he like wants to make things and do things. At least that's how I've always felt. I was never kind of like, what maximizes my happiness? It was like, how do I actually do things and produce things and have some kind of impact and connection? Yeah.
Yeah. I love this term from Aristotle called eudaimonia, which is, I think, translated kind of as flourishing. And it's basically like, what's the mark of a good life? And it's flourishing. And it's not happiness. It's not, he goes through all this kind of like different, it's like, it's not how much pleasure you had. It's like, are you flourishing? And then it goes into like, well, what does that mean? And there's obviously different ways you can kind of interpret it. But like, I think that is at the end of the day, it's like, do you feel like you led a flourishing life, or was it small and not?
I like that. Flourishing life that's a good term. Yeah. But yeah, you know, I think anyone who probably gets into the arts in some level, like, has some drive to contribute to the world in that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is also the maybe the dumbest last question I've ever asked, but I'm wondering, do you think being named Lincoln in a southern state kind of pushed you apart from other people at all?
You know, maybe. I don't really remember too many people getting mad at me from like a kind of conservative point of view, like, oh, you're named after the leader of the War of Northern Aggression. But I do remember getting a lot of being teased by that name. But yeah, I do kind of like having a unique name. Maybe there was some like small part of me that was like, oh, you're like slightly different from other people. I don't know. But that sounds so weird to say now. Like, I don't feel like, oh, I'm so different from other people. But as a kid, it was kind of like,
yeah. These are, look, I'm throwing out feints, seeing if it works, if there's like a kernel of something, a grain of something. It may or may not be. But I do think those little things, like at the beginning of your life, then I'm holding my fingers about 1 millimeter apart for the listener. But like, there's those little things that then grow into these like things that eventually pry you apart from other people and give you the space to make art. Again, just a theory with almost no real empirical data behind it, just anecdotal chats on the show, which is what we do every week on Beginnings. Lincoln, though, thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
I love your writing, and I was so glad we could talk.
Yeah, this is really fun. Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have a more like kind of clear psychoanalysis of myself. I don't know if you feel this way, but I always feel like what's something that's interesting is the way that we self-mythologize these paths. Because I could name all these reasons why I became a writer, but I also wonder, like, if I had become a comedian or, you know, a visual artist or something, like, I could look back and carve a different like memoir for myself, kind of.
100%. I've thought about that, and I've really wanted to talk to people who have written memoirs. Like, I almost stay away from them just because they've calcified their story. But I know, as someone who's been interviewed, and I wonder if this is the same for you a lot, is that like, I have a story that I've calcified, and it's this, and it goes A, B, C, D, E, and that's why I am here where I am. And I don't engage with that calcified story much anymore.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think like I don't know, like none of this is super revelatory, but I read voraciously from a young age. So like that's a very easy like, oh, then I became a writer. But if I was a musician, I could easily be like, oh yeah, like, music is what shaped me when I was in high school, or, I played all these different instruments, even though I did and failed and didn't become a musician. Yeah, I don't know. That kind of stuff is interesting to me. I think that that's something that people are like, also maybe, I don't know. That's something of the time, right? With all these multiverse movies and TV shows coming out where everyone's like, what could be different life paths?
Yeah. Well, that's why I think walking down this kind of existential path is much more fruitful for a discussion of like why people become the things they are. Because like there are plenty of voracious readers, and there's plenty of people who read like Italo Calvino, all the like Oulipo people, and are bankers or whatever, right? And again, like I said, I'm not like judging anyone for whatever they do, but like it doesn't necessitate. There's no necessity to that. There's no necessity I can go into counterfactuals. If in college I was in a band, and if my co-songwriter didn't go to grad school, we would have continued on with the band, and we could have we were slowly rising in that, and slowly, we were going to release a tape on a label. And, at the time, when you were mostly buying cassette tapes, right? And CDs in the early 2000s. That could have happened. And then I don't know what I could have had the courage to break away from my parents' wishes earlier. And instead of going to grad school, move to New York to do comedy. Like, there's a lot of these kind of like little things that didn't happen. But I think the existential stuff of where you grew up and like how you reacted to your parents and the people around you are the things that really led you in this direction.
Yeah, I think that's all right. And yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to think about. Sorry, this is a very dull final response from here. I had some like thought that was bubbling up, and then it drifted away in the heat.
Yeah, I feel you. That's most of my existence.
Oh, I know what I was going to say. This is maybe not that interesting either, but I do, when I was young, I would always read these quotes from like writers that would be like, oh, you're a writer if you like just have to write. Or it would be like, only become a writer if you have to write because it's a horrible career.
Right.
And I don't know if I agree with that exactly, but I do think that, like if I'm not creating something, I feel like bad.
Yes.
And I think that's like the artist drive, right? Like you like have to do it or you like feel bad.
Yep. Yep. I think that's really it. I think there is this kind of like very basic emotional thing where like you start to get itchy. I know my wife's a stand-up, and if she does a lot of other stuff too, but like the stand-up is the thing for her, and that if she doesn't do stand-up for a while, it starts to like build up. It's the same thing of like I don't write for a while, it starts to build up in me, and it doesn't feel good, and that's it. It's this basic kind of like bodily response. It doesn't feel good.
Yeah. Well, I think that's totally true. I actually have to stop and do that thing. I was like,
Lincoln, thank you again for joining me. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye.